Good evening, everyone. It gives me immense pleasure to be introducing the speaker for today's session, Mr. Anand Atre. Anand is an alumnus of KLS GIT and he graduated with a degree in electrical and electronics in 1986. He went on to pursue his master's in electrical engineering
1986
at New Jersey Institute of Technology. He also holds an MBA degree from the University of North Carolina. He started his career with Sun Microsystems, where he worked for over 11 years. His professional journey saw him serve in different capacities at Oracle Corporation and Cisco. From December of 2020, Anand has been the Deputy Chief Security Officer with Crux Informatics based out of New York City. Anand holds a certificate in cybersecurity from the Harvard University. Cybersecurity for a cloud-native enterprise is the topic that Anand will be deliberating on. With that brief introduction, I hand over the session to you, Anand.
Great. Thanks, Padma. Thank you for that introduction and good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here. Also want to thank the HOD, Dr. Raj Purohit, and the organizing committee for inviting me to speak at the Winter School. I've done many talks through my career, but this one is a particular privilege because it's to my old college. And as you heard, it's been a fairly long and satisfying journey for me over the last 30 years. But I still remember starting it at GIT. So this is a particular privilege for me. I know many of you are attending this school, this winter school on cybersecurity, thinking about whether this is the right area for you to go into from a career perspective, or if you're already in your career, if this is an area that you would like to go into. And I can tell you, my experience over my career has been that the harder the problem, the bigger the challenge, the bigger the opportunity is. And cybersecurity is probably one of the hardest problem right now, at least in our professional area. So I think from an opportunity perspective, this field is right. And what I'm hoping to do in today's session is to give you a little better picture for what actually is involved in cybersecurity. So cybersecurity is broad and deep, right? So I always like to say it's 10 miles wide and 10 miles deep. And when I was looking at the schedule for this program, there was many really interesting sessions I noticed. In fact, earlier today, there was one on zero trust. I hope you guys got an opportunity to listen to that. It's a great area. There were others on digital forensics. There's AI for cybersecurity. These are all great areas and could be an entire job or even a career within themselves. But from my perspective as a security leader, I have to take a broad view of cybersecurity. So it's the 10-mile wide view. And what I would probably be doing today is giving you that high-level purview of cybersecurity, sort of at a 30,000-foot level, right? So let's dig into that. Let me just make sure this works. Okay. So we're going to start with looking at why cybersecurity is such a huge area right now. You've heard the statistics, right? There's 3.5 million jobs in cybersecurity, which are open, and also, you know, the amount of money that is being spent. I'm based here in the New York area, and I can tell you some of the big banks here, they're spending billions with a B dollar every year on cybersecurity, and there's a reason behind that. So let's look into that. The other thing I want to share with you is also my own experiences since taking this role. So there are certain things that are generally misunderstood about cybersecurity during Hi, someone needs to mute, I think. Okay, thanks. So I'll cover a bit of that, and also, what are the imperatives in cybersecurity. Then we'll look into the cloud security specific areas. So cloud native computing is one of the fastest growing areas right now, and it brings with it some particular challenges. And the reason I wanted to go into that and pick that as a topic is, especially for early in career people, this is an area that has great momentum. So it would be something that really helped propel careers ahead. So I think this would be of interest to this audience in particular, and we'll cover some of the strategies to address those challenges in cloud native security. And then I'll try to leave some time for questions at the end. If you do have questions as we go through this talk, put them in the chat room. I'll try to cover them if necessary during the talk. If not, we'll look at them at the end. So that's the plan. Why is cybersecurity such a big deal? Well, cybersecurity is big business. Cybersecurity Ventures, which does estimation of what cybersecurity would cost the world economy, has predicted that by 2025, it's going to cost the world economy almost $10.5 trillion. That's up from, I think it was 3 trillion in 2015. So it's growing at a very rapid rate. It's probably close to 6 trillion this year. And just to put that in perspective, that is more than all the illegal drug trade combined. So cybercrime is very, very lucrative, right? Another perspective on it is, if this was an economy, it would be the third largest economy in the world. So obviously there's big money in cybercrime, and that is what attracts cyber criminals, right? So if you look at the left of the slide, I've used one of the threat landscape reports, one of the popular ones out there, to show what the key threats are right now. And one of the biggest trends that we see, and as you read through those slides, I won't go through each one of them, but one of the biggest trend is that cybercrime is now almost all about monetization, right? It used to be, yes, there's still some political purposes and some espionage that goes on, but for the most part, it is becoming a monetization venture for cyber criminals. And with that, what you've seen is the rise of ransomware, things like ransomware as a service or phishing as a service, where the cyber criminal doesn't necessarily have to be as well-versed in technology and as much of an expert as just being part of an enterprise. And because of that, the volume is growing, right? And when that happens, the threat landscape changes. So in the past, you would have very directed attacks. Now, what you see is sort of like a broad net that's spread, and anyone who gets caught in that net becomes a victim of cybercrime. And we'll talk a little bit later about what threat is versus what risk is. But for now, you can basically take risk as the potential impact, monetary impact that a successful cyber attack will have, right? So on the right of the slide, you see all the different kinds of impacts cybercrime might have on an enterprise. So it could be direct, it could be like fraud or actual money being taken, or money you have to pay, like ransomware. It could be disruption of operations. If there's a successful ransomware attack, businesses have to shut down, and that costs money. Loss of confidential information and intellectual property is also a big deal for most corporations. And the damage that gets in terms of public's confidence in doing business with you, especially if you're a business like a bank or some institution that relies on consumer trust, then these things can be pretty serious from a business lost opportunity perspective, right? So this is why cyber security is such a big deal right now, because there's so much money in it. There's also another interesting phenomenon right now, particularly after COVID, because of the rapid adoption of cloud, that a lot of the leaders, business leaders, are now seeing cybersecurity as a competitive advantage as well. So the ability to securely digitally transform is something that's giving companies a leg up in competition. So the net of this is, if you look at cybersecurity as a profession today, there's huge opportunity, because there's a lot of downside, there's also upside. So companies are going to invest on both sides of that coin. And as a cybersecurity professional, you are able to help the organization in a significant way. So that's something that is a important thing to keep in mind. So when I first took this role, I did have quite a bit of background in security, as well as in risk management, which is how I got into cybersecurity. But still taking an operational role and looking at this as a security leader has given me some insights that I wanted to share with you. The first one is the misunderstanding that sophisticated security technology is what we need, right? It's what's going to keep us safe. That's not true, because generally, like in any other endeavor, it's about operation and maintenance of that security. And also, humans are usually the weakest link. So just sophisticated security is not going to keep an organization safe. Yes, it helps. So if you think about like biometric identity or using AI for detection, things like that will definitely help, but they are not the end goal of cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is about a holistic view and making sure that all the tools that are brought in to bear are properly configured, properly managed, properly operated. Think of the analogy I like to give here is, think of the airline industry, right? Think about airplanes, and there's so many sophisticated safety systems on an airplane today, redundant systems as well, but we still have incidents. And the reason for that is it still boils down to proper maintenance and operation, and also the human factor in that. So the first big myth is that it's just about sophisticated technology. And this is something that I keep telling, because I talk to vendors as well, and they are rightfully excited about their products. But actually, successful cybersecurity is more about taking that technology and making it operational. The second myth that I run into all the time is, oh, we have a very strong security team. They're going to take responsibility and keep us safe. That is not true. Everyone is responsible for security. Obviously, security and IT have a big role to play in setting up the processes and the tools and the actual security controls. But as we will see later in this presentation, cybersecurity is a very pervasive area of an organization, or very pervasive challenge in an organization, and everyone on the team, everyone in the organization is responsible in their own way to keep the company safe. Think of it as, thinking about the police are responsible for my personal safety. Yeah, the police are responsible in a sense, but you are responsible as well, and primarily responsible, and you have to understand what your own role in cybersecurity is. And finally, the last myth I'll cover here, there's many others, but these are the top three in my mind, is that perfect cybersecurity is possible. Given unlimited budget, all the skills you need, are we done? And this is a question I get asked, right? Because a lot of the business leaders are, basically, okay, understood, this is a big problem. What do I need to invest? What do I need to buy to make this, to fix this? And one of the hard realities of cybersecurity is there is no perfect cybersecurity. It's an ongoing process because it's a constantly changing threat. You have new technologies come in. We're going to talk about cloud native technologies. Those didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago. So if you had perfect cybersecurity 10 years ago, it would be pretty much worthless now because the entire computing landscape has changed. And then it's an ongoing process, right? So it's more about keeping the technologies up to speed with what's happening. And the other side of this is the attack surface has grown so much now, especially with cloud, especially with the pandemic where everyone was working remotely, that you almost have to look at this as a matter of resilience. The thought process is, oh, we've been breached already, right? And working and putting in controls so that we can get back and fix the problem as quickly as possible. So instead of a purely defensive, no one can get in possibly, you have to look at this as yes, someone's going to get in, a breach is going to happen at some point. How do we quickly detect and fix it, right? So resilience is ultimately the goal of cybersecurity. So those are the big 3 myths that I want you to keep in mind as we go through the rest of this, because they kind of dictate the approach we take in cybersecurity. So let's look at what the picture overall is. And this slide is somewhat of a architecture that I like to follow when it comes to cybersecurity. Any cybersecurity or information security endeavor is usually to do with what we call the CIA triad, right? So it's about maintaining confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your information, of your systems. The cybersecurity controls that get put in are essentially for these purposes. So, having username, password, and MFA, multi-factor authentication, is about only letting people in who are authorized to be in, which means you're protecting the confidentiality and the integrity of the system. Ransomware attacks, DDoS, you've heard these terms, right? So these are primarily targeted towards availability of a system. So whether you encrypt all the data of the organization and then demand a ransom to unencrypt it, or if you set up a massive attack, a denial of service attack, you're attacking the availability of that system and thereby that organization's ability to do business. So the controls that get put in place, so anti-malware, DNS protections, those are oriented towards availability. So any goal of a cybersecurity or information security control can be put in the context of that confidentiality, integrity, and availability triad. Now, that triad applies to not just technology, it applies to all layers of the organization. So you start with platform and obviously detecting vulnerabilities, making sure the identities, digital identities are managed properly, keeping your data encrypted. Those are things that you can do at a platform level. But applications sit on top of the platform, and if there's a flaw in the application, anything within the platform that you've put in place to protect it is somewhat useless because the application is going to let the malicious actor in. Just as curiosity, maybe you can put this in chat. Has anyone heard of the Log4j problem? that happened last December? Just type in yes or no or in the chat. I don't see, yeah, I see a couple of people typing in. So that was a perfect example of how an application vulnerability can override all the other security controls that you put in place. Just for people who may not have heard, Log4j is a Java library that's what you pretty much used on any enterprise Java application. Its job is to do logging. And there was a vulnerability that was discovered where there was almost a trivial exploit possible where you could do remote code execution on that application. Now, if my application is allowing you to come in and execute remote code on my system, there's very little at a platform level I can do to protect it. So application security is as, and if not more important. And particularly for this audience, since we are in computer science, keep that in mind. Whether or not your job is directly in cybersecurity, you have a huge cybersecurity responsibility because you hold the keys to security as much as the security team does. And then going up the stack, you know, there's process issues that have to be managed. So any changes that are made, detection of any intrusion through security operations. And then finally, at the people level, perhaps in my mind as a security leader, the most important layer is the security culture and the awareness and the training that we do for end users, because all of us are end users. Ultimately, whatever our role is in the organization, we're all end users of the system, and understanding the needs of security, understanding what you in your role need to do is of vital importance, because like I said at the beginning, humans are always the weakest link in this chain. And I'm going to talk more about that later. The final point on this slide is that all of this can be looked at from different perspectives. So you have obviously the IT and security perspective where you're setting up security controls, but then the developer has to understand what needs to be done to keep the application level secure. And the end users have to look at this from a perspective of how do we operate the platform and the applications safely. So this slide kind of crystallizes in my mind the cybersecurity architecture almost of an enterprise. Now, this is not cloud specific yet. This can apply to any enterprise, traditional or cloud, but it also goes to show why cybersecurity is such a hard problem, right? Because it goes across so many layers and so many dimensions, across so many perspectives, that keeping all those moving parts in place, or keeping track of all those moving parts, is a challenge that a cybersecurity professional, and particularly a leader, has to handle. So let me move on. Any questions so far that can't wait till the end?
There's nothing, Anand. You can proceed.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So let me talk about what we refer to as the weakest link, and this is something that applies to all of us. So it's worth spending some time on. So Bruce Schneier is a famous cryptographist who's fairly well known in the cybersecurity industry, and he said something that has become that I found was very profound. And basically, it's that only amateurs hack systems, right? Professionals hack people. And yeah, you still have some zero-day attacks, et cetera, that happen that are primarily targeted towards a system vulnerability. But for the most part, cybercrime is conducted by hacking human emotion, right? Social engineering. And social engineering is basically hacking human emotion. Now, the statistics, these vary, but typically what you'll find is almost 90 to 95% of successful breaches at some point have used social engineering to get in, either to get someone's credentials or get them to do something that compromises the security that the organization set up. And there's a variety of ways of doing it. Underlying that is the basic premise of exploiting human emotions. And there's a simple reason why professionals go after people first, right? Computers are consistent. So yeah, if they're set up wrong, they'll be consistently wrong. But if you have reasonably competent IT staff and security teams, they'll set up your systems so that they cannot be, in general, they'll do something in a fairly reasonable fashion to keep you reasonably safe. The weak link is humans, right? We as humans make mistakes when we're tired, when you're under pressure, or we are driven by emotion. And typically the emotions that make us do something that we shouldn't be doing are fear, greed, curiosity, or anger, right? And if you look at the attack vectors used in social engineering, phishing, baiting, pretexting, quid pro quo, these all target these emotions. So phishing, we all have seen these emails where you're told your bank account has been shut down or something like that. There's a element of fear that gets induced. Right away, you're thinking, oh, this is going to be a big problem. And before you know, you click on it, right? So that's how phishing exploits emotion. Baiting is another popular technique that plays on greed. There are messages that are sent out saying, oh, you've won a lottery or something, and all you need to do is pay a little bit of money and you're going to make this much money. And that triggers the greed emotion, right? So none of this is particular to cybersecurity. Crime is as old as humans. So it's the same techniques, criminal techniques that are being used. They're just being used using cyber technologies. But where they become more dangerous is the fact that now cyber technology allows the criminal to stay a lot more anonymous behind the ether, so to speak, and thereby gives them that ability to have cast a broad net. If you remember on the first slide, I talked about how criminals have now gone to this as a service kind of model where they get ready-made tools that they can just use rather than have to design the attacks themselves. And that gives them the ability to do these broad nets and stay anonymous while preying on the same old vulnerabilities that have for many years been exploited by criminals, okay? So this is a topic in itself. We could talk for days just on the human factors in cybersecurity. I would highly encourage anyone who's interested to just go on YouTube and look for, just Google or just Google this topic, and you'll find lots and lots of interesting videos that talk about this. The one in particular, if you look up DEF CON, that's a industry event that happens once a year where pretty much all the hackers, hopefully all the ethical hackers, go to learn about hacking techniques. And you'll find that there's so much science and the pretty sophisticated ways of exploiting human factors in cybersecurity. But let me talk about the fundamentals here, because it's important for us to know. The fundamental reason that we can be socially engineered is because we have cognitive biases. And a cognitive bias is nothing but a shortcut that our mind has developed because usually there's too much information coming at us and we don't have the ability to actually process that information. But it was important from a survival perspective for humans for a long time to actually be able to take action quickly, whether or not you've had the time to process the information to decide if it's important, if it's something you want to retain. So we've developed these biases, and these are just part of us. So we have to understand them. And I've put a link in here. Feel free to go look it up and read the biases if you're interested. I'll take an example here. The lower left-hand corner, you see a bias called halo effect, right? So what is that? The halo effect is that if we like one aspect of anything or anyone, we generally ascribe a lot more good attributes to that individual or that system. So simple example for day-to-day life is, let's say some food is advertised as fat-free food, right? So we doesn't necessarily mean that that's totally good for you, right? It could be high in sodium on the other hand, right? But it could be fat-free. But once you see that fat-free label, you think, oh, this is good. This can't be bad. And that's also why marketing people spend so much time on these labels, right? Because it kind of covers up for all the other problems that might happen. Cyber criminals exploit this. So if they can build some kind of a rapport, some kind of a trust element with us, we start thinking that this is not so bad, and we can trust this person, or we can trust this email, and that's kind of what gets exploited. So that's an example of how a cognitive bias is used to hack humans and socially engineer us into doing something that we shouldn't be doing. By the way, just out of curiosity, that works the other way as well. So it's called the horn effect. So if there's one thing we don't like about something, we generally tend to think that it's not good at all, and that may not be good either. So sometimes, and the reason I say that is sometimes cybersecurity can be a little inconvenient when the security people are making you put in that OTP when logging in every time. Yes, it can be an annoyance, and you think, oh, this is not good, this is not worth it, but it doesn't mean that it's not good at all. There might be some inconvenience, but our mind is trained to think in that binary fashion. So it's important to understand that we have these biases inside us, and we need to just be cognizant, right, to avoid being exploited. The other thing that gets exploited by hackers is the fact that we have a duality in the way we think, right? So Daniel Kahneman, who's, I believe, a Nobel Prize winner, has built this system one, system two thinking paradigm, where we have two ways of reacting, right? One is what's called the fast thinking. This is primarily a survival mechanism that's built into us way back when humans had to react quickly to any environmental stimulus to basically protect themselves. I mean, it could be a tiger attacking them or something. Before you had time to take in all the information, we had to react, and the fast thinking does that for us, right? Now, there is another system which is more rational, which is slower but more methodical. It's the system two thinking. You can think of that as a rational mind, but it's harder to engage and it takes time. So what we call the reflex reaction is usually done by fast thinking, and hackers will exploit that, right? So, on the previous slide, I talked about fear. So fear typically will trigger system one thinking. And before you know it, you've clicked on that link, or before you know it, you answered that voicemail. And the whole idea for hackers is to keep you in that system one thinking and not let you engage the system two rational mind. And it's something that we have to be cognizant of. And if you sense urgency being pushed on you or some kind of pressure being put, that should be a red flag, and you can step back and say, let me think about this, so that your rational mind can come into the picture. All right, so let me move on because like I said, I can talk for a day about just this aspect of it. So let's talk about what cloud is and what cloud native is. So everything we've talked about so far is kind of generic to cybersecurity. Cloud native is a fairly recent phenomenon in the computing world, and I'm not going to go into the details of it because I'm sure this is something that, as in computer science discipline, you will be able to learn in much more and much better detail than I can tell you here. But at a very high level, this is about applications that are built ground up for the cloud environment. So on the right, what I've tried to capture here is the what, the why, the how of cloud native computing. So cloud native is applications built to run on cloud environments like public, private, and hybrid clouds. And the reason we want to do that is the ability to be truly agile, to make quick but high impact changes with minimal effort that keeps the velocity of delivering applications high. And the way it's done is typically the patterns, at least today, are the use of microservices, where there is fine partitioning of functionality in an application, and each one of them can be deployed independently. There's this whole paradigm of 12-factor applications, which I'm sure as computer scientists you may be aware of, or you can understand better than I can. But essentially, the use of microservices, containers. I'm sure you're all familiar with Docker and similar container technologies. Service meshes to allow these to work together, using infrastructure as code. So now, not only especially in the cloud environment, you are defining your entire environment with code, and so on and so forth. So, those are the patterns that are used today to deliver cloud native. And the goal obviously is, an environment which allows you to scale. The whole, purpose behind this, behind cloud is scaling, but also make it resilient, plan for failure, make it observable, be able to provide that velocity in application delivery. You've heard of continuous integration, continuous delivery as a process, which is part of the whole DevOps movement. So that gets used. And then finally, the as a core discipline around building infrastructure as well. So, it's an interesting point here. If everything's code, what is infrastructure and what's application? So just as a academic point, applications are what businesses use to make money, and infrastructure is what supports it, right? So that's the only differentiation. But that is what cloud native looks like. If you want to dig deeper into this, I would highly recommend looking up this Cloud Native Computing Foundation website. There's a link at the end I have put in the resources. It's a Linux Foundation program, and I think it'll help you understand this approach much better than I can explain it here. The challenge of cloud native, and this is also from that CNCF website, is that it's an exploding ecosystem, right? There's so many components, and the purpose of the slide is not to go through it, obviously. There's so many components that it's even hard to keep up with them. There's 6 major categories plus a special category. But keeping all of this in sync, remember that comment about will perfect sophisticated technology actually make us secure? Well, here's the problem, right? You have so many moving parts that keeping all of them in sync and secured is the challenge of cloud native computing. So how are we going to address that? So let's look at the 4 layers that, the 3 layers we talked about in the applications, plus the fourth layer that comes in as part of an enterprise. So what's a cloud native enterprise? So you take the cloud native application construct and add the corporate or the cloud itself, and you get the kind of the logical structure of a cloud native enterprise for code running in containers, running on Kubernetes clusters. By the way, I named Kubernetes here because that, I think, is one of the most important technologies that is becoming almost a de facto standards from a OS for cloud native applications. So I would say, this is something worth learning from a computer science student perspective. There's also something called Knative that's coming up. So look into that. That would be very useful. And then finally, the cloud layer itself, it could be one of the major public cloud providers like AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, could be a private or a hybrid cloud structure, but adding that on top. And then applying security controls at each layer is what is required from a cloud native perspective. So secure software development lifecycle at a code level, making sure that your open source dependencies are secure. I mentioned the Log4j issue that had come up in December of last year. That's open source, right? So almost all cloud native applications depend on open source at some point. So you might be introducing vulnerabilities into your code without even realizing it. So making sure those dependencies are covered is an important aspect of securing cloud native enterprise. At a container level, think of it as the old VM paradigm now at a container level. So all the controls that go on there, cluster, is now sort of the operating system. So access management, keeping your data encrypted, managing who has, not only individual, but what services can connect to the cluster is all the security that needs to be managed at a cluster level. And then finally, at a corporate level, you have to have a broad governance and risk management process, which keeps track of all of this. Identity is more and more critical. We'll talk more about both of these in a few slides. And then, managing the cloud itself. Now, the cloud plane is something that's new in the cloud paradigm that didn't exist in the traditional data centers. But managing security at that cloud plane level, because that's basically your cloud console that lets you set up the cloud infrastructure, is a critical aspect of securing cloud native enterprise. Having said that, you can generically talk about these controls in standard environments as well, the traditional environments. Cloud native brings some special challenges, and I've picked like four challenges to talk about here. It's a busy slide, so I won't necessarily read through all of the slide here, but on the left-hand side, you see the challenges that are the most important right now. The first one is the fact that security now gets shared with the cloud security provider, whether it's Google, AWS, Azure, or some hybrid cloud provider. You don't have full control on the cloud. So how do you implement the security policies and controls that normally in a data center you would have full control upon, right? So that's a challenge. You no longer have the traditional perimeter, the network perimeter. So you can't just put a firewall and an intrusion detection system at the front end of it, and then once someone is authenticated, let them have access to applications, right? So that doesn't work because you're now in the cloud, and where is the perimeter? So that leads to a problem where you can't trust. There's no implicit trust, and that kind of creates a problem on how access control needs to be managed. We talked about cloud native applications and methodologies like CI/CD. What's happening there is you're going from the traditional waterfall to agile to now a point where updates to applications are done almost on an hourly or at the very least daily basis, and security just cannot keep. Traditional security cannot keep up with that pace. Traditional security was once a release is kind of ready, then security teams would go in and basically look at the code and see if there's any challenges or anything that needs to be fixed. That would take too long, and if that was to be used here, then it would negate the entire reason for going to cloud native and CI/CD, because now you're creating a bottleneck in delivering the functionality that the business needs. And then finally, like we said before, cloud greatly increases the attack surface. So much so that almost no cybersecurity team, even though extremely well-funded ones, like the ones I mentioned earlier, big banks here who spend billions of dollars in cybersecurity, even they cannot keep up with everything. And if something is not done about it, then the real threats may not get addressed, and cybersecurity teams will just fall behind in a big way. So there are certain strategies that need to be used to address these challenges. And if you look at the right-hand column on the slide, I've listed some of them, right? So the first one is, clearly understand, and we'll talk more about each one of these in the subsequent slides, but at a very high level, using contractual agreements becomes as important as implementing controls, because now you need some other party to implement security controls to keep your environment controlled. So there's this concept of shared responsibility that becomes very, very critical. There was a talk on zero trust security earlier today. I hope you caught it. I won't go too much into it, but the fact that you can no longer implicitly trust anyone or any identity requires a zero trust approach and using identity as a parameter. So which is a very interesting concept. So that's a strategy. And DevSecOps is something that you might have heard about. This is about shifting left, meaning security becoming part of the development and operational process itself, rather than being a gate that you have to pass through. That helps make it as fast as the cloud speed and keep up with the application velocity that is required by business. And then using a risk-based approach to cybersecurity instead of the traditional maturity-based. What I mean by that is, in the past, people would look at security controls and say, how good is my malware, anti-malware protection? How good is my antivirus software, right? Is it the best possible? That is kind of immaterial if that is not where your biggest risk is, right? So actually identifying what your biggest risks are and focusing on those is an approach that becomes critical in the cloud environment. And this might seem very logical, but in practice, it's very hard to do, because keep in mind, you're talking about hundreds, if not thousands of risk factors. And managing it in a proper, in a systematic way becomes quite an endeavor, right? So that's a strategy that is critical in securing cloud native. So I'm going to go into each one of the 4 strategies that we talked about in a little more detail. Probably don't have time for a lot because I think we're coming up on the hour, and I do want to keep some time at the end for questions. So let me just go through these very quickly. There's resources at the end of the presentation that you can certainly go into to look into these in a much more detailed fashion. So the first one we talked about was the fact that cloud security is shared with the cloud provider. What you see on the left is a very typical representation of how the responsibility decreases or increases depending on what delivery model is used. We are probably all familiar now with the different delivery models. You have on-prem, which is, you have your own data center, you control pretty much everything. Infrastructure as a service, think about VMs in the cloud. So the cloud provider is taking responsibility for the physical hardware part of it, but everything above the hypervisor level is your problem. So that's IaaS. Platform as a service takes it one step further above. And then finally, software as a service, which means you're basically just connecting in and creating an account for yourself. The cloud provider is doing pretty much everything except for your login and your data, right? So those are the service models. The delivery models are actually public, private, or hybrid. It becomes a matrix, but it's more important to look at the delivery model, the service model than the delivery model in terms of understanding shared responsibility. And, it's just a logical thing that you have to understand this really properly. What am I responsible for? What is the cloud security provider responsible for? There are always gray areas. It's not as simple as is depicted here. So understanding those gray areas, making sure that when you enter an agreement, you have the right contractual agreement. Now, if you're creating an account in AWS or Google or Azure, they're not necessarily going to negotiate a contract with each one of us, right? But at least understanding what exactly is our responsibility is important, because there's always some part of it that we are responsible for, even if the cloud provider is taking responsibility for some part of it, right? And understanding that becomes important. From a security leadership perspective, one of the things that I work on, as much as the technology side of it, is the contractual agreements that we enter into with our vendors, and making sure that there are no gray areas where if there is an incident, there's no finger pointing with people saying it's your problem to each other. So that's the first strategy. I won't talk about zero trust too much right now, again, because there's been, I think, some really good sessions on this topic already. Hopefully you've caught them. The bottom line is that the traditional security paradigm of having a perimeter and then trusting an individual or a system because of their location, whether they are within your privileged network or not, it no longer works, right? So essentially, you can never trust. You always have to verify. You have to inspect not only the IP, which is the location of that system or user, but also the context, right? Who is the user? What is their entitlement? Are they entitled to this system? So on and so forth, right? And then make a decision based on what is the least privilege required to satisfy that request. And then continuous monitoring of this is important. So that's zero trust in a nutshell. I'm not going to go more deeper than that because it's been covered in other sessions already. DevSecOps, we talked a little bit about this, why this is needed. So shift left basically is a buzzword you'll hear in the industry right now. Essentially, what that means is there's been studies done that if you look at your software development and deployment process going from left to right, the further to the right you are in that process, when you detect and fix a security issue, the longer it takes to fix that issue and the more costly it is in terms of time, et cetera, to fix that issue. So the further to the left you find and fix security issues, the cheaper and faster it is. And the whole shift left movement is intended to do that. Now, from a delivery methodology perspective, most of the world has moved on from the old waterfall technologies and are already using agile methodologies of some sort, right? So there's short sprints that basically are used to deploy functionality. Now, DevOps was a step further in that the operational teams now were working hand in glove with the development teams, and there was a continuous loop of feedback loop from operations on to the development teams, right? So they, instead of being two separate teams with the developers throwing code over the wall to the operational teams to run and monitor, there is now a integration between those teams. So that was DevOps, which was probably one of the big changes that happened last decade. Where shift left is going is now security needs to get integrated into that. So if you look at the edge of each one of those sections, security should be there, right? As well as part of that, that process itself. So while we are coding, for instance, developers should be trained in secure coding practices. I know OWASP is a very active organization. I would highly recommend looking at their website and looking at the top 10 OWASP vulnerabilities, for instance. Every developer in my mind should be aware of those, because if you are aware of secure coding practices, the problem is solved at the origin itself, and you don't need all the security testing and everything afterwards, right? So that's part, but making security requirements part of the testing requirements at the end of development is also important, because typically what happens is business is interested in functionality. So there's going to be a functional testing done. No one really pushes to have security testing done at the unit testing level, for instance, but it should be done at that stage, because again, remember, shift left. So as computer science professionals, this is something that you should look into and keep in mind as one of your biggest contributions to cybersecurity in an organization. And given the importance of it, someone who has that security mindset is a very, very valuable asset. I'll tell you from my vantage point as a security leader in an organization, I don't have a huge team, right? We generally, security teams work in a virtual fashion. So what I try to do is find champions within every functional team, in the development team, in the infrastructure team, who are people who have the security mindset and have security skills that can work with me and my team in making the overall process secure. And if this is something that you invest time in, you will become very valuable, certainly to the security, your CISO for sure, but to the organization in general. Okay. So the last strategy that I'll talk about is risk-based approach to cybersecurity. And there's a reason I left it to the last, right? Because this is one of my pet topics. Remember, I came into cybersecurity through risk management, and it's been something that I've been pushing for a while in terms of the approach to cybersecurity itself, right? So let's look into this in the next 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll wrap up. So let me get some terminology straight first. And that's because generally these terms get used interchangeably. So let's talk about vulnerability, threat, and risk. So vulnerability is just a weak spot or weakness that can be exploited. Threat is the event or the actor that actually exploits the vulnerability, right? And the risk is the impact of that exploitation or that action can have. So I'll give you a real life example. If you leave your front door unlocked, that's a vulnerability, right? But if no one's coming by, you live on a deserted island, doesn't matter, because there's no one to come in and actually exploit it. Now, normally for us living in civilization, there's going to be some threat. So that could be a robber that walks along and finds an unlocked door and opens it and comes in, right? So that's now the action that has exploited the vulnerability. So a threat actor has acted on a vulnerability to create an incident, right? Or create a threat event. Now, that still would not matter if it was just an empty flat, right? There's nothing to steal. So what are you going to do? But if you have a lot of valuables in the flat, then your risk goes higher. So risk ultimately is the impact of a threat acting on a vulnerability, right? So keep that in mind. Why is that important to understand? Because in terms of prioritization, right now in cybersecurity, there's a lot of attention paid to vulnerabilities and threats. So you hear about vulnerability scanning, threat modeling, you hear about threat landscape. We started this talk with that. But ultimately what matters is the risk. What is really at risk here, and what is that really needs to be protected. And having a clear picture of this will guide our efforts much better in cybersecurity than just focusing on trying to get every vulnerability patch, right? Try to put in every patch that ever is published. It's just not practical, especially in the cloud world. So impact analysis is what does that. Risk appetite is also critical. So risk appetite basically is a business decision generally made by organizations to say, I can tolerate up to this much loss, right? Beyond that, I cannot. I'll go out of business, or it'll have some really detrimental effect on my business. And this is a business decision. So, it's not a technology or a security decision. It has to be something that gets made collectively with business leaders. So, risk appetite is something that becomes critical to the risk management process itself, because it is a threshold above which you have to take some mitigation actions. Below that, you can choose to accept that risk. So, the fact that you don't necessarily have to act on every risk is driven by the risk appetite. And then finally, there's inherent risk and residual risk. So the reason that's important is there's inherent risk in almost anything, right? And there's certain things that get touted as being very risky. Yes, you are going to the cloud, and now your account can be hacked by anyone. Yeah, so the inherent risk is pretty high. But it's not that we don't do anything about it. We generally have some security controls in place. But the question is, after enacting that control, what is the risk that's still left over? So if I am putting in multi-factor authentication to all my systems, then my residual risk is pretty low. It's not zero, but it's low. And that's why residual risk becomes the most important consideration in figuring out where you're going to focus your cybersecurity efforts. So given that context, the process itself, it's intuitive, right? You just basically do an assessment and identify, what are your vulnerabilities, what are the possible threats, and identify top risk. The fact that it's logically simple doesn't mean it's actually practically that simple. It takes a lot of work to do this, but that's essentially what you want to end up with by identifying the highest risks you have in the organization, and then perform an impact analysis. What is the impact you see? The matrix you see on your left is a very simple representation of that impact analysis. Yeah, there's a likelihood of an event happening, right? The threat, and there's a consequence, which is the impact. And depending on the combination of those two is what you're going to use to make a decision whether I act on this or not. You could have something that has a very low likelihood of happening, but if it happens, you basically go out of business, right? So even though it's a low likelihood, your risk is still high. On the other hand, there might be an event that happens pretty much every day, but the impact is so low that you just accept it, right? It's fine. So, let's say you're talking about confidentiality of documents, and if those documents themselves are just marketing material, well, no problem, right? So the impact is very, very low. So you say, fine, I won't worry about it. But if those same documents are about the company's strategic plan for the next 5 years, yeah, that's, even though they're well protected, the fact that if those got out could have a significant impact on the organization is a very, high risk to your organization. So, use that paradigm to prioritize and then implement security controls accordingly, and then monitor. So again, it's not a static exercise. So that's the final strategy. So given that, let's summarize. I think we're coming up on time, almost exactly. So let me quickly summarize what we've gone through. We looked at why cybersecurity is so important. The fact that there's so much money in it has a lot to do with it, which is why the volume is going up, and so is the sophistication. It's something that's driven mainly by human weakness. That's a non-intuitive part of it. Everyone thinks of cybersecurity as primarily a technology issue. It is a technology issue, but a cybersecurity professional has to have a mindset where they're also understanding the human behavior behind it. And that's what makes for a successful cybersecurity professional. And then it's a joint mission with everyone on the team. It's not a one person or one team mission. In your personal lives, one of the ways to protect against social engineering, because we are faced with this every day, is critical thinking. And what do I mean by that? Is just pause, just stop, look around, think about it, right? The minute your rational brain engages, you will see the red flags in that particular situation. But if you let your emotional or system one thinking take control, and that's what the hacker is going to try to do, you're likely to fall for that social engineering attempt. So in general, cybersecurity is a big deal. Cloud is making it even more risky because the attack surfaces grows, and you have a very rapid, the speed of all events goes up in the cloud. And then the fact that transitioning from traditional to cloud native security requires technology, but also process and organizational change, right? So it's not enough to just take what you've done in data centers and just put that in cloud. Cloud behaves differently. Things like zero trust, for example, things like needing to have shared responsibility. These are unique to the cloud. So those require both technology and process changes. So understanding that, working with development and operations team, or rather development, security, and operations teams working together to make it work is important. Zero trust, we talked about, making sure the infrastructure is up to scratch with the needs for cloud native applications is important. And then finally, making sure everyone engages with security teams and partners to really keep the organization safe is critical. So that's pretty much what I wanted to cover today. The last slide I have sample resources if you want to dig deeper. I am a big fan of the NIST cybersecurity framework. It's one of the most flexible frameworks. It originated for government purposes here in the US, but it's been very widely adopted. So, take a look at it. I know internationally ISO tends to be, there's a standard ISO 27000, which tends to be used as much or if not more. So whatever, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. It doesn't really matter. It's picking a framework and sticking to it. That's important. The other resource that I rely heavily on is Cloud Security Alliance. This is for cloud security, right? Not cybersecurity in general. Cloud security itself. Take a look at their website. Lots of great resources. I mentioned CNCF, Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Again, great resource. OWASP, absolutely a must for developers. Please look at it. Spend some time. It's time well spent. And then if you are actually working on a particular cloud, look at the service provider security resources as well. Each one of them provides a lot. And because it's in their a vested interest as well to make sure all the users are fully up to speed on their security capabilities. So take a look at those resources. And I know generally I get asked these questions, asked the question, so I'll sort of preempt it. In terms of training yourself, is formal education in cybersecurity and certifications important? I would say they help, right? Certainly formal education will help. It's not necessary. In my mind, most security professionals that I know of have come in from other disciplines. So I don't think cybersecurity as a formal education is necessary. It certainly helps. But certifications are absolutely worth the time, because especially for early in career professionals, like a lot of people on this audience, they help to prove to potential employers that you have the skills needed, right? And then we can have a conversation beyond that. We can talk about attitude and aptitude and things like that, and have the skills proven through a certification. So some of the ones I've put up, a couple of ones that are cloud specific. Again, CSA, Cloud Security Alliance, has the CCSK certification that's fairly easy. ISC2 is a very popular organization for certification. Their flagship is the CISSP, but they have a cloud specific certification, CCSP, which is useful as well. And again, the cloud platforms themselves provide certifications you want to look into. All right, so with that, I will pause and let's go do some Q&A. I think we have about 10 minutes, right? So that's we should be able to take a few questions here. So either we go through the chat room, I'm looking at it now, or if anyone has questions, just unmute yourself and ask.
Anand, I think there's one question in the chat room.
Okay.
You want me to read it out for you?
Can you please?
Yes.
Thanks.
So there's a question from Tabriz. He says, we know what all needs to be done, but still hackers rule the roost. Could you possibly apprise us about the essential knowledge gaps that would enable cybersecurity folks sabotage hackers?
Okay, so that's an interesting topic. Yeah, there's this whole thought process around offensive security, right? So typically you have the defensive side of it, which is what Tabriz is saying here, that what I talked about was pretty much all about defensive security. And I wouldn't necessarily agree with hackers rule the roost. Yes, you do get headlines, but I don't think they're as successful as the headlines tend to suggest. I think we do fairly well in protecting against these hackers. But having said that, the question is, what should we do about actually taking the fight to them? So I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's about how do we go, kind of take them out in the first place. So there are a couple of things, right? So one thing is what's known as TTP, techniques, tactics, and procedures. So TTP. These are, and there's one thing I would recommend here. MITRE has an attack framework. So MITRE, MITRE, for those of you who know, I can put it in the chat as well. They have an attack framework, and they publish these TTPs, common TTPs for attack vectors. Get to know them, right? Because it's all about knowing your enemy. What are they going to try to do? And then anticipating that, looking at mapping that to your own environment, saying where could this be successful if used against me, and then fixing that, right? So that's the knowledge gap that you're talking about. So MITRE attack framework, TTPs listed in that, and then applying them to your own organization. That's one. There are people who want to go beyond that. And I think now, especially in the last year or so, government organizations have started taking the battle to the cyber criminals themselves. I know here in the US, what they've done is they've basically taken out infrastructure that these criminal gangs were using and basically, become gone on an active offense against them. That's not always possible for end users. So as a security leader, I don't have the resources to go actually fight with them. I can do protection, which is what I focus on. But certainly knowing the enemy is one of the most important things you can do to try to keep ahead of them. Hope that answers the question.
Yes, I guess so. There's another question. Actually, not a question. There is a request. If you could suggest some Azure resources.
Truth be told, I'm most familiar with Google because that's the platform we use. I'm not as familiar with Azure. There's a link I've put up in the resources on the resources section. You can certainly go there and look for resources. I don't know if I can, off the top of my head, suggest any more for you, but here's my contact information as well. So if you have a specific question around it, I'm more than happy to look into it and get you more information.
All right. Any more questions from the audience?
Okay. Well, they don't have to come right away as well. Again, here's my contact information is here. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or via email. I'm happy to take questions that might come up later. And if there's anything else I can help with, I'm more than happy to. Like I said at the beginning, it is a special privilege to talk to my own college and my own college mates, if you will, even though quite a few years apart here. So yeah, certainly feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to work with you. The thing I'll leave you with is my personal experience is coming into cybersecurity is you don't necessarily have to be in security all your career, right? Cybersecurity is pervasive. You can be part of cybersecurity while in your own discipline, whether you're doing development, data science, whatever your field is, that can be applied to cybersecurity. So think of it that way. If you do choose to come in to cybersecurity itself, there's many possible ways of doing that. But the point is that this is one of the biggest opportunities right now because it is one of the hardest problems that we are trying to solve, at least in our area of the profession. And that creates opportunities. And certainly for people on this call who probably have a longer career to think of than I do at this point, this is going to be a vector that's going to take you quite far. So, if you're looking for a challenge, if you're looking for an opportunity that sticks, and I know in your shoes, many years ago, that's what my thought process was, what's going to take me far enough into my career, I would certainly consider cybersecurity.
Yes. One last question that I have from my end, Anand, if you could possibly take it.
Sure.
Yeah, this probably could be some kind of advice rather than a question. So what I would like you to possibly elaborate is while in their 4 years of engineering, let's leave the first year, probably the second, third, and the fourth year of engineering. What could students possibly do to orient themselves towards a profession in cloud security in terms of, probably the technologies that they can, probably learn, or the tools that they can learn?
Great question, right? And I'll put a caveat there. This space moves so fast, right? So the specific technologies will be outdated pretty quickly. So I wouldn't necessarily go to a technology level. I did mention Kubernetes as one of the ones that you want to look in at this point in time, because that looks like it will be pretty much a standard going at least for the short term. So get to know these foundational technologies, but it's more of the pattern, right? So at a at a second, third, or fourth year level, especially at a senior or final year level, I would say look at the methodologies that get used. So understand DevSecOps, understand cyber risk management as a process. Understand identity management, right? Identity management is a discipline in itself. If you understand these core areas, then when you come into the industry and you want to apply for a job in either in cybersecurity or cybersecurity related disciplines, you will have the context in which you can apply your skills. So I would certainly, if I was to prioritize there, I would say identity management is one of the most important areas that you could understand really well. So identity is both identity and access management. So if you understand that very well, then it opens up a lot of opportunity for you.
All right. Thank you so much, Anand. Any questions from the audience? Probably the last chance, after which we will wind up the session. If there are any questions, you can unmute yourselves and have the question. All right. Looks like there are no more questions, Anand. I would like to take this. Okay, there's one question that just popped up. Any tools for cloud security as I'm teaching? This probably is from a faculty. So are there any tools that can be taught for cloud security?
There are plenty of tools. Let me take that offline. I will respond to that later on.
Okay. And yeah, and there's one more question. What are the crucial factors to consider while choosing a cloud security provider?
Okay, cloud security provider. So there's no one such thing as cloud security provider. That's one of the problems, in that there's so many tools and so many providers that the end user ends up stitching them together. What I would say is, in that way, the most important thing is not to look at point solutions, things that solve just one problem, but look for platforms that offer integration. Because I'll tell you the flip side of that. What happens is, if you have these point tools that claim to be the best in doing what they do, whether it's endpoint security or whether it's malware protection or whatever it is, the key to cybersecurity is having a holistic picture and integrating those tools and integrating the data from those tools becomes very, very hard. Now, it's a question of knowing what exactly is going on. It's never one event that is the indicator of compromise, IOCs as we call them. It's usually a pattern, and that pattern goes across multiple systems. So being able to integrate these tools and integrate the data from these tools, it becomes really, really critical. So if a provider can give you a platform that combines multiple tools, that becomes a lot more valuable from an end user or a security leader perspective than getting the best of breed tool for a particular problem. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, I think there's one more question that came up. We moved from legacy to cloud. I was wondering what next? Security as a service to security is service.
What's next?
Yeah.
Well, I think something becomes really mature when we stop talking about it as a separate discipline. So I would say security is, and you say it here, security is service. Yeah. So, when we stop talking about security as a separate product and separate discipline, that's where I think we are going, because, I'll tell you for instance, right now we're still talking about cloud, but it's quite a foreseeable future where we stop talking about cloud as a separate thing, and that becomes synonymous with computing. And I think security should go in that direction, right? So not be a bolt-on, but be part of the computing discipline in itself. I think that's kind of a very broad answer, but that's the best I can do right now.
All right. Thank you so much. Okay,
My pleasure.
I think that was probably the last question we had time for. Okay. So somebody wants to know, before we wind up, somebody wants to know, shall we reach out to you via LinkedIn?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I think the LinkedIn. Yeah, I think the LinkedIn is shared there. His contact details are shared. So maybe you can just connect to LinkedIn or either through his email ID, which is visible on your screens right now.
Yep.
Yes. So to wind up, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Anand for taking time off his busy schedule and probably waking up early in the morning to have this session for us. And so on behalf of the organizing team and on behalf of JIT, heartfelt thanks to Anand for having spared his time and delivered a very resourceful and knowledge filled session. Thank you so much, Anand.